I didn't realize my son was using me until the day I noticed that every time he called, he needed something. It wasn't a sudden discovery. There wasn't one dramatic moment where the truth arrived all at once. It was quieter than that. Slower. Like a fog that settles over a field so gradually that you only realize how thick it is when you try to see across it. For years, whenever my phone rang and his name appeared on the screen, I felt the same small rush of happiness. The kind a parent feels when they hear from their child. Even when children grow into adults with lives of their own, something inside you still reacts the same way it did when they were little. You hear their voice, and some part of your heart remembers the sound of their footsteps running through the house. My name is Robert. I'm 71 years old, and I live in the same house where my son grew up. It's not a large house. Just a 2-story place at the end of a quiet street. When my wife and I bought it nearly 40 years ago, it felt enormous to us. 2 bedrooms upstairs, 1 small room downstairs that we turned into an office, and a backyard that seemed big enough to hold an entire childhood. Back then, the neighborhood was full of young families. On summer evenings the street was filled with bicycles, basketballs bouncing against driveways, and parents standing on porches calling children home when it got dark. My son Daniel was born 2 years after we moved in. I remember the first night we brought him home from the hospital. The house felt strangely quiet, as if it were holding its breath. My wife Margaret carried him into the living room and sat carefully on the couch while I hovered nearby, unsure what I was supposed to do. He was so small. His entire hand barely wrapped around my finger. I remember thinking that it was strange how someone so tiny could suddenly become the center of your entire world. Daniel grew into one of those energetic boys who seemed to move through life at a faster speed than everyone else. By the time he was 5, he had already climbed every tree in the backyard and ridden his bicycle down the driveway so many times that the pavement developed faint tire marks. Margaret used to say that raising him felt like trying to keep up with a small hurricane. But she always said it with a smile. Our house had a rhythm in those years. Mornings started with the smell of coffee and toast. Margaret moving around the kitchen while the radio played softly in the background. Daniel sitting at the table swinging his legs because they were still too short to reach the floor. He had a habit of asking endless questions during breakfast. Why do birds fly in groups? Why does the neighbor's dog bark at the mailman? Why can't pancakes count as dinner too? Some mornings I had answers. Other mornings I just laughed and told him we'd figure it out later. After breakfast I drove him to school on my way to work. Those drives were only 10 minutes long, but they were filled with stories about playground adventures and imaginary plans for what he would do when he grew up. At one point he wanted to be a firefighter, then a race car driver, then an astronaut. Children change dreams quickly. But the excitement in his voice never changed. Evenings were my favorite time of day back then. I'd come home from work, loosen my tie, and step into a house that felt alive. Daniel usually met me at the door with something he wanted to show me. A drawing from school. A new baseball card. A science project that involved far too much glue. Margaret would be in the kitchen making dinner, pretending not to watch us while we talked in the hallway. Dinner itself was always together at the table. Margaret believed in that strongly. No matter how busy life gets, she used to say, families should sit down together at least once a day. So we did. The table became the center of our home. Daniel telling stories about his teachers. Margaret reminding him to eat vegetables. Me trying to pretend I wasn't as tired as I sometimes was after a long day at work. After dinner there were dishes, homework, sometimes a television show before bedtime. Ordinary routines. But when I think back now, those routines feel like some of the most important moments of my life. Because ordinary days are where families quietly build themselves. As Daniel grew older, his world slowly expanded beyond our house. Little league games. School friends. Weekend sleepovers. The garage became his workshop when he turned 12. He spent hours out there taking apart old radios and broken appliances just to see how they worked. I remember one Saturday afternoon when I found him sitting on the garage floor surrounded by pieces of a disassembled alarm clock. "What happened to the clock?" I asked. "I'm learning," he said proudly. "It never worked again." But that didn't seem to bother him. High school arrived faster than I expected. Suddenly the boy who once needed help tying his shoes was borrowing the car and talking about college. Margaret cried the day we dropped him off at the university. I tried not to. But when we drove home and his bedroom door stayed closed for weeks afterward, the house felt different. Quieter. For a while, Daniel called often. Sometimes late at night after studying. Sometimes during long walks across campus. We talked about his classes, his friends, the strange excitement of being on his own for the first time. Those calls meant a lot to Margaret. She'd sit nearby pretending to read a magazine while listening to half the conversation. Eventually, he graduated. Found a job in another city about 2 hours away. Not too far, we thought. Close enough for weekend visits. And for a while, that's exactly what happened. Daniel came home every few weeks during his first year working. Sometimes he brought laundry. Sometimes he just wanted a good meal and a quiet place to rest. Margaret loved those visits. She cooked all his favorite meals: roast chicken, mashed potatoes, apple pie. The house came alive again when he walked through the door. Then life kept moving. Daniel met someone. A woman named Lisa. They married a couple of years later and bought a small house not far from where he worked. Margaret and I were proud of him. He had built a life of his own. That's what parents hope for, after all. But time has a way of stretching distances even when the miles stay the same. The visits became less frequent. Work kept him busy. Bills. Responsibilities. All the things that come with adult life. Margaret used to say that it was normal. "Children grow up," she would remind me gently. "They build their own homes." I knew she was right. Still, I always felt a small burst of happiness whenever the phone rang and Daniel's name appeared. Even if it was just a quick call. After Margaret passed away 5 years ago, those calls meant even more. The house became quieter without her. Not empty exactly, but quieter in a way that made every sound stand out. The refrigerator humming. The clock ticking. The wind brushing against the windows at night. When Daniel called during those first months after her death, I held on to those conversations. They made the house feel less silent. Less alone. But gradually, something else began happening. Something so subtle that I didn't notice it at first. Every time Daniel called, he needed something. At first it seemed completely reasonable. Advice about a car repair. Help with a down payment on a new place. A loan to cover an unexpected expense. Parents help their children. That's what we do. I never questioned it. Not once. Because when you spend decades taking care of someone, it becomes part of who you are. But one evening last winter, something happened that made me pause in a way I hadn't before. It was a Tuesday. I had just finished dinner and was washing dishes when my phone rang on the kitchen counter. Daniel's name appeared on the screen. I dried my hands and answered with the same quiet happiness I always felt when he called. "Hi, Dad." His voice sounded hurried. We talked for a minute about the weather. About work. About how busy life had been lately. And then, just as naturally as breathing, the conversation turned. "Dad, I actually wanted to ask you something." I leaned against the counter, listening. And for the first time in many years, a small, unfamiliar thought crossed my mind. I couldn't remember the last time he had called simply to talk. And that thought stayed with me long after the call ended. Quiet. Uncomfortable. Like the beginning of a realization I wasn't yet ready to face. For a long time after that evening, I tried not to think too much about the thought that had crossed my mind. It felt wrong somehow. Unfair, even. Parents aren't supposed to keep score with their children. That's something Margaret used to say whenever I complained about Daniel forgetting to call for a few weeks. "He's building a life," she would remind me. "We did the same thing when we were young." And she was right. Life pulls people in different directions. Work, responsibilities, families of their own, those things fill the days faster than anyone expects. So I told myself that the uneasy feeling I had after that phone call didn't mean anything. Still, the thought had planted itself somewhere in the back of my mind. Once a thought settles there, it has a strange way of appearing again when you least expect it. A few weeks later, Daniel called again. It was a Sunday afternoon. I had just come back inside after raking leaves in the backyard. The maple tree that had shaded Daniel's childhood was shedding its last orange leaves of the season, and the yard was covered in them like a quiet blanket. I made myself a cup of coffee and sat at the kitchen table. The same table where Daniel used to sit swinging his legs while asking endless questions about the world. The phone buzzed beside my cup. "Hi, Dad." He sounded tired. We talked about small things for a minute. The weather. The leaves. His work. Then, almost exactly the way it had happened before, his voice shifted slightly. "Dad, can I ask you something?" The words were the same. So was the pause that followed them. This time, the thought returned immediately. I still listened. Of course I did. He explained that one of his bills had come up unexpectedly. Something about repairs to the car and a payment that had arrived earlier than he expected. He asked if I could help him out for a little while. "Just until next month," he said. I told him not to worry. I had some savings. I always kept a little money set aside for emergencies. Helping him felt natural. It always had. But after we hung up, I sat at the table for a long time staring at my coffee. And something strange happened. Instead of thinking about the money, I found myself thinking about the conversation. Trying to remember what we had talked about before the request. The answer surprised me. Almost nothing. A few polite questions. A quick comment about work. And then the request. The pattern was so quiet that I had never noticed it before. But once I saw it, I couldn't unsee it. Over the next few months, the pattern continued. Daniel called every few weeks. Sometimes the conversation lasted 5 minutes. Sometimes 10. But almost every time, somewhere in the middle of the call, those same words appeared. "Dad, I actually wanted to ask you something." The reasons were always understandable. Car trouble. Home repairs. A temporary gap between paychecks. Once it was something about medical expenses for his daughter. That one didn't even require a second thought from me. Of course I helped. But after each call, I began to notice something else. The silence afterward felt heavier. Not because I regretted helping him. I never regretted that. But because something in the conversations felt incomplete. When Daniel was a boy, he used to talk endlessly. About school. About friends. About the strange things he noticed in the world. He once spent 15 straight minutes explaining why he believed ants were smarter than people. Now, when he called, the conversations felt rushed. Focused. As if they had a destination. And once that destination was reached, the call quietly ended. I told myself I was imagining things. That it was simply the way adult life worked. But then something happened one evening that made the realization harder to ignore. It was late autumn again, nearly a year after the first time that uneasy thought had crossed my mind. The house was quiet. I had finished dinner and was sitting in the living room reading a book when the phone rang. "Daniel," I answered, feeling that familiar mix of happiness and curiosity. This time he didn't even begin with small talk. "Hey, Dad," he said. "Are you busy?" "Not really," I replied. There was a brief pause. Then he said it again. "Dad, I need a favor." I listened as he explained that he and Lisa were having some financial trouble. Something about unexpected expenses and needing help covering part of a loan payment. It wasn't a small amount. Not the kind of thing that could be easily replaced. As he spoke, I found myself looking around the living room. At the photographs on the shelf. At the quiet furniture. At the empty chair where Margaret used to sit while knitting in the evenings. And suddenly another thought appeared. one that felt even heavier than the first. When was the last time Daniel had asked how I was doing? The realization arrived slowly. Not like an accusation. More like a question I hadn't known to ask before. I tried to remember our recent conversations. The calls. The messages. The visits. But the memories all seemed to follow the same pattern. He called. We exchanged a few quick updates. And then he needed something. Money. Advice. Help with a problem. And for the first time in my life as a father, I felt something I had never felt before. Not anger. Not resentment. Just a quiet confusion. Because I suddenly realized that I couldn't remember the last time my son had called simply because he wanted to hear my voice. That realization stayed with me long after the conversation ended. I didn't confront him. I didn't even mention it. Instead, I sat in the living room with the phone resting quietly on the table beside me. And I found myself remembering something Margaret once said years ago. It had been during one of those evenings when Daniel was still a teenager. We were sitting at the kitchen table after dinner, talking about how quickly he seemed to be growing up. Margaret had smiled and said something that felt simple at the time. One day, she said, we won't be the center of his life anymore. I had laughed. Of course we wouldn't. That was how life worked. But now, sitting alone in the quiet house years later, I began to understand the deeper part of what she meant. Parents spend decades giving their children everything they can. Time. Energy. Love. Support. And most of the time, we never expect anything in return. But sometimes, quietly and without realizing it, we hope for one small thing. To still matter. To still be part of their lives in a way that isn't only about what we can provide. That night, as I turned off the lights and walked through the quiet hallway toward the bedroom, I realized something that made my chest feel unexpectedly heavy. For years, every time Daniel called, I had assumed it meant he wanted to talk to me. Now I wasn't so sure anymore. And once that question enters your mind, it changes the way you hear every future phone call. For several weeks after that realization, I didn't hear from Daniel. At first, that wasn't unusual. There had been longer gaps before. Life has a way of filling days faster than we expect, especially when you're raising children and trying to keep everything else together at the same time. Still, something about the silence felt different this time. Maybe it was because the question had finally surfaced in my mind, the one I had quietly avoided for months. Or maybe it was simply that once you notice a pattern, every new moment either confirms it or challenges it. During those quiet weeks, I found myself thinking a lot about the past. That happens more often as you get older. Memories become clearer somehow, as if time slowly polishes them until the small details begin to shine again. One afternoon I went out to the garage to look for a screwdriver. The garage had always been Daniel's favorite place in the house when he was young. Even now, decades later, some of his old things were still there. A dusty baseball glove on a shelf. A toolbox he had insisted on owning when he turned 14. A small wooden birdhouse we had built together one Saturday morning when he was 9. I picked up the birdhouse and turned it over in my hands. The paint was chipped now. One of the little wooden sides had come loose. But I could still remember that morning perfectly. Daniel had been so serious while building it. Measuring pieces carefully, hammering nails with his tongue slightly sticking out the side of his mouth in concentration. At one point he looked up at me and said, "Do you think birds will actually live in it?" "I think they might," I told him. We hung it in the maple tree later that day. For weeks afterward he checked it every morning before school, hoping a bird had moved in overnight. Eventually one did. And when he saw the small nest inside, he ran back into the house shouting with excitement, as if he had discovered something truly miraculous. Standing there in the garage all those years later, I realized how strange it was that the same boy who once needed help hammering tiny nails was now a grown man with a house, a family, and responsibilities far beyond anything he had imagined back then. Life moves in one direction. Forward. And sometimes, when you look back, the distance between those moments feels almost impossible to believe. A few days after that afternoon in the garage, Daniel finally called again. It was late in the evening. I was sitting in the living room watching television when the phone rang. For a moment I simply stared at the screen. His name. The same small rush of happiness still appeared, just like it always had. But this time something else appeared alongside it. Curiosity. I answered. "Hi, Dad." His voice sounded tired again, but warmer than it had in recent conversations. "How are you doing?" he asked. The question caught me slightly off guard. Not because it was unusual, but because I couldn't remember the last time he had started a conversation that way. "I'm doing all right," I said. We talked for a few minutes. About the weather. About the grandchildren. About the maple tree in the yard that had finally lost its last leaves. The conversation felt different. Slower. More natural. And then, after a short pause, he said something I hadn't expected at all. "Dad, I've been meaning to come visit." I sat quietly for a moment. "You don't have to if you're busy," I told him. "No," he replied. "I want to." 2 days later, Daniel knocked on the front door. When I opened it, I was surprised by how much older he looked. Not dramatically. Just the small things. A few gray hairs near his temples. Lines around his eyes that hadn't been there before. But when he smiled, I still saw the boy who used to run through this house with grass stains on his jeans. We sat at the kitchen table for a long time. The same table where so many conversations had taken place over the years. At first we talked about ordinary things. Work. The kids. How quickly life seemed to be moving. But eventually the conversation slowed. And then he said something quietly that I hadn't expected. "Dad, I think I owe you an apology." I looked at him. "For what?" He stared down at his hands for a moment before answering. "I realized something recently," he said. "What's that?" He took a breath. "I think I've been calling you only when I needed something." The honesty in his voice surprised me. For a moment neither of us spoke. Finally I said, "Life gets busy." "That's not really an excuse," he replied. Then he looked up at me again. "I was talking to Lisa the other night. She asked me when the last time was that I called you just to talk." He shook his head slightly. "I couldn't remember." The room felt very quiet then. Not uncomfortable. Just thoughtful. "I guess I got used to knowing you'd always be there," he continued. "And I stopped thinking about what that really meant." I leaned back in my chair and looked at him. For a long time I had believed that the moment I realized the truth about those phone calls would bring anger or disappointment. But sitting there across from my son, I felt neither of those things. Instead, I felt something else. Understanding. Because being a parent teaches you something important over time. Children don't always see things clearly while they're living their lives. Sometimes they're simply trying to keep up with everything happening around them. Work. Bills. Families. Responsibilities. And in the middle of all that movement, they assume the people who have always been there will simply continue being there. Not because they don't care, but because they trust that love doesn't disappear. "I never minded helping you," I told him quietly. "I know," he said. "That's part of the problem." We both smiled slightly at that. Then he said something that stayed with me long after he left that evening. "I want to start calling just to talk," he said. "Not because I need something." I nodded. "I'd like that." That night, after he drove home, the house became quiet again. The same familiar silence filled the rooms. But this time it felt different. Because I had learned something important that day. The moment I realized my son had been using me wasn't actually the end of something. It was the beginning of a conversation that probably should have happened sooner. Families change as time passes. Children grow. Lives become complicated. And sometimes relationships drift into patterns we don't notice until someone finally stops and looks closely. But love has a way of surviving those moments. Sometimes it simply needs a little honesty to find its way back to the surface. Later that night, As I turned off the lights and walked through the quiet hallway toward bed, I paused for a moment in the kitchen. The same kitchen where Daniel once sat asking endless questions about the world. The same table where we had shared dinner thousands of times. And I realized something simple. Being a parent means giving more than you ever expect to get back. But every now and then, life surprises you. Because sometimes, after years of quiet distance, your child walks back through the door, not because they need something, but because they finally understand what they almost lost.